Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. Certainly want to say thank you to those of you that gave last week during our Truth Team 360 week, and we'll certainly give you an announcement on how we did. So this is a great opportunity for all of us to be grateful for the gifts that you have given to us and for all the blessings that each one of us receives. So again, I want to thank you about that. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Well, for those of you that look ahead, you notice that we originally had scheduled an interview today with Ed Klein. He, of course, was with the New York Times and has written a number of blockbuster books, has one on Hillary Clinton, and I thought it would be very appropriate as we go into the various debates. We have a Republican debate on the 10th, a Democratic debate on the 14th, but some personal matters came up, so he cannot join us. So this ends up being sort of an open line in the first hour. I will be talking with Newt Gingrich in the second hour, as well as his wife a little bit later, Callista Gingrich. But while we have some time together, this would be a good chance to deal with some of these important issues that are certainly surfacing. And for the next few minutes, I'd like to address this issue of media bias. There are two ways in which you see media bias. One is by an attempt to maybe color your perceptions, either with a headline or with selectively selecting some facts or interviewing one side of a controversy but giving short shrift to the other side of the controversy. And that certainly applies to what has happened to Ben Carson over the last couple of days. But there's a second way, and that is, in some respects, a media bias by omission. And we're going to talk about that as well, because there's a very good piece out by our good friend Robert Knight, who has been on with us last week, and he's talking about some issues that will relate to that as well. But let's come to this issue of Ben Carson. On Friday, we wondered whether we should raise the issue about that, and sometimes there is value in waiting and see how the story actually unfolds, because if you're not familiar with the story, there were headlines that were actually claiming that indeed Ben Carson had fabricated his story about West Point and receiving a scholarship, and that appeared in Politico. And then you had some people sort of jumping on the story, some saying, well, let's just wait and learn a little bit more. Others say, this might be the end of the Carson campaign. Well, we've learned a little bit more since then, and this has been something that's kind of interesting. Molly Hemingway, writing in The Federalist, said that if anything, the fabrication happened on the side of Politico. She says Politico's Kyle Cheney admitted that he fabricated a negative story about Ben Carson. At least according to his own standards, he admitted the grievous journalistic sin. In a story published early on Friday, Politico's Kyle Cheney authored a piece headlined, "Ben Carson Admits Fabricating West Point Scholarship." With a subhead, Carson's campaign on Friday conceded that a central point in his inspirational personal story did not occur as he previously described. She says, though, there is a problem with the story. Actually, there are 5 major problems with the story. Number 1, the headline was completely false. Number 2, the subhead was also completely false. Number 3, the opening paragraph was, as she said, false, false, false. Number 4, the substance of the piece was missing key exonerating information. And number 5, the article demonstrated confusion about Service Academy admissions and benefits. But other than that, A-plus work for Kyle Cheney and Politico. Of course, she's placing her tongue well in the cheek here. And, of course, you can read the story if you want, because a lot of it goes back to the book by Ben Carson, Gifted Hands, which, by the way, is a movie, and you might even want to see that movie. It's available on DVD, or you can download it from iTunes and watch it. But in there, he talks about then when he was 17 years of age, was introduced to General William Westmoreland. For some of our Vietnam vets out there, by the way, we're going to say a lot about the vets this week. You remember who he was. Of course, he was the individual that had commanded the forces in Vietnam. Well, anyway, Ben Carson and General William Westmoreland dined together, and that meeting, according to Ben Carson, was followed up with a full scholarship to the Military Academy, West Point. And, of course, the story in Politico said that West Point had no record of extended admission, and when presented this evidence, supposedly the campaign admitted that it was false. Well, we learn a lot more about this now, and I can go into all the details, but as a matter of fact, I'm going to open up the phones in just a few minutes because you've probably been following the story and have maybe discovered some other things as well. But first of all, if you go to the military academies, whether it's West Point, whether it's the Naval Academy, whether it's Air Force Academy, guess what? You are on scholarship. And some people say, yeah, but they don't call it scholarship. Well, you can actually find some advertisements that do call it scholarship. So first of all, that's the case. As far as anybody can determine, and you can go actually back to his book, he didn't say that he applied. As a matter of fact, I think there's a story that I remember recently where Ben Carson said for every application, and I remember doing this when I applied to more than one university, you had to file an application fee. And he said, you know, each one of the applications cost $10. I think that's what he said. And I only had $10, so he applied to Yale and got into Yale. End of story. And so he never even applied to West Point. And really, the point of the story in Gifted Hands is, even though that was a nice offer, yes, you're such a qualified individual, I think you could probably make your way into the academy. He basically said, no, my goal is medicine, and that's, of course, exactly what he did. So this idea that he claimed that, and more importantly, that it was a fabrication, is itself a fabrication. Dave Weigel, for example, who with the Washington Post, interestingly enough, in a tweet, and I've got it in front of me here, pointed out that when Politico took out the word fabrication, he said, well, taking fabrication out of that headline is like taking uranium out of an A-bomb and out of an atomic bomb. So you can see that there has been a little bit of a backtracking on Politico, and so that is. But the one that kind of got us attention a little bit was Eric Erickson, because, you know, after all, we know who he is, and he's been on the program, not recently, but he has, and he was the one that was kind of concerned, and so what he has now put out is a piece that says, hit the brakes on the Ben Carson story. And he says, I've struck through the original piece here. It looks more and more like the details of Ben Carson's West Point story are more nuanced. In 2003, he said he was offered a scholarship to West Point. The political story centers on Carson claiming he applied and was accepted. It is true Carson never applied and was never accepted, and the representation from Politico is demonstrably false. By the time you go to the second page by Eric Erickson, you see that most of the story that he actually wrote that we were talking about on Friday and wondering if we should even go on air, start covering it, has been crossed through. And so there is a lesson to be learned, and one of those lessons is sometimes when you hear a story, get another perspective, get another viewpoint, wait a little bit to see if some other things begin to surface. The scriptures tell us that, you know, oftentimes when you hear a person telling one story, you think it's true until you hear the other person's side of it, and you recognize that there's some more to it. And that's exactly one of those sort of biblical principles we can apply. But when we come back, I also want to raise the broader question, and that is something that Ben Carson has been saying, and others have been saying as well. Hugh Hewitt was on CNN the other day making this comment, and that is we are actually scrutinizing Ben Carson, or at least the mainstream media is scrutinizing Ben Carson in ways that most of the mainstream media never scrutinized, wait for it, Barack Obama. If it weren't for some of the things that came out of Fox News, some of those questions about Jeremiah Wright and about his background may have never surfaced. So we'll talk about that, and Howard Kurtz has some things to talk about on that topic. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Universities talk a great deal about free speech, but they have been clamping down on speech they don't like for many years. When I first started speaking on college campuses in the mid-1970s, I was impressed that professors would invite a Christian speaker into the classroom. Sometimes they would even say to the class, "You have heard my views on this subject. In the interest of academic freedom, I wanted to give you a chance to hear a Christian's view on this subject." In the late 1980s, I noticed that political correctness was taking over and opportunities in the classroom waned. In fact, university administrators often warned faculty not to have outside speakers in the classroom. Soon this applied not only to Christian speakers, but any speaker, like a conservative, that wasn't deemed politically correct. Sadly, students have accepted this situation as normal and normative. Young America's Foundation, working with a polling company, surveyed 1,000 college students about their attitude towards free speech. They found that students generally supported the abstract idea of free speech, but rejected the idea if the speech is not politically correct. They agree with the proposition that undergraduate education should include a diversity of opinion, but when that diversity included conservative ideas, support dropped significantly. This may sound confused and contradictory, but David French in a recent column says that he doesn't think students are confused at all. Perhaps they're good learners. Colleges by word and deed teach students that there is free speech, the speech that they value enough to protect, and not speech, the expression they really don't like. He's correct. University students have learned their lesson. Free speech is speech they like, and everything else does not deserve protection. That is why they allow universities to promote speech codes and protect them from free speech that they will soon experience once they graduate from college. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
No doubt you've been hearing some of the comments being made by Ben Carson and others about Ben Carson. Love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. And we're going to talk not only about some of the claims made by Politico and the response by Ben Carson, but also get into some other aspects of media bias. And if you'd like to join us, let's open up the phones. 1-800-351-1212. Howard Kurtz oftentimes is the what you call the ombudsman, or an individual that oftentimes looks at the way in which the press covers or fails to cover stories. And since we are talking about a media bias, and definitely in this case, maybe even with Politico, what some people referred to as yellow journalism, let's see what Howard Kurtz has to say. And the question he asked in his piece that came out today is, Carson's war on Politico, CNN, and the media, has the scrutiny gone too far? I'll give you his conclusion. No, not necessarily. These are the kinds of questions we should ask. I'll be at least honest enough to say that those kinds of questions should be asked, but sometimes they were not asked of course, our sitting president, Barack Obama. I mean, really, you can go down the long list. Has anybody seen the transcripts from Occidental or from Columbia or from Harvard? Have anybody seen all sorts of various other aspects? How much did anybody try to trace down some of the people that actually went to school with him and said they hardly ever see him? What about that composite girlfriend? And you can go down this long, long list. And if it weren't for some of the people, maybe mostly at Fox News, saying, what about Jeremiah Wright? And what about some of his associations with various individuals, Frank Marshall Davis and all sorts of people. Those questions really never got asked. And of course, now they're asking individuals who grew up with Ben Carson about some of the stories. So anyway, let's hear what Howard Kurtz has to say. And he says, the topsy-turvy spectacle has been nothing short of bizarre. Ben Carson insisting that he was an angry teenager who once tried to stab someone, while a media organization says he was a nice kid. And yet that prompted the presidential candidate to denounce CNN for peddling garbage that he dismissed as a smear. A day later, Carson accused Politico of an outright lie for reporting that he had been falsely claimed in his autobiography to have been given a full scholarship to West Point. Of course, we just talked about that a minute ago. And Howard Kurtz says that Ben Carson seems deeply offended that journalists are digging into his past and challenging his veracity, though that's standard procedure in presidential campaigns. This is where I might disagree. I mean, some people have really been given a pass in the past. But let's go on. At the same time, he's scoring points against the unpopular media, which have overreached at times in digging into the doctor's past. These biographical details may matter more to Carson than to most candidates, since his inspiring life story, from an impoverished childhood with a single mother to world-class neurosurgeon, is the bedrock foundation of his campaign. The irony is that Carson's quiet dignity and low-key temperament are a major source of his appeal, but in denouncing the media in recent days, he looks downright angry. Frankly, I think that's a positive, because some people wondered what would it take for him to be upset about some things. I mean, he is very even-keeled, and I don't think there's any reason why he couldn't occasionally want to pound the pulpit and say this is something that has gone too far. But let's continue. Howard Kurtz says what CNN set out to do by talking to old friends and neighbors was not a smear. The network never accused Carson of lying, but reported that 9 people interviewed had said violent outbursts would seem utterly out of character for him. But the clear implication was that Carson had perhaps been exaggerating the stabbing incident, and another in which he said he almost hit his mother with a hammer. The network didn't have the goods and probably should have held the peace for more reporting. The story prompted Carson to acknowledge to Megyn Kelly that the person he tried to stab was not a friend, he said in his autobiography, using a phony name, but a close relative, and that he had an epic on-air battle with CNN anchor Callista Gingrich, insisting that some justification the People Network interviewed had no way of knowing about violent incidents in his past. The next came the screaming Politico headline that Carson had admitted fabricating a story about West Point. This was way overstated, which was underscored what the website generally softened the headline. Carson told Bill O'Reilly that he was not, in fact, offered a scholarship to West Point, but he'd been told he would have had an easy time if he applied. And applying, all cadets actually attend free, is a complicated process that requires sponsorship by a member of Congress or the Secretary of the Army. The Wall Street Journal joined the fray over the weekend, questioning, among other things, an anecdote in which Carson says that when his fellow black high school students erupted in anger after the murder of Martin Luther King, he protected a few white students from the attacks by hiding them, but the paper could not prove it didn't happen. These distinctions and discrepancies undoubtedly seem minuscule to Carson's fans, who have pushed him into a neck-and-neck competition with Donald Trump in national polls. The same goes for the flaps over what Carson has said about the pyramids, Nazi Germany, and other off-topic subjects. A more experienced politician would be accustomed to the scrapes and scratches inflicted in media scrutiny, and of course Ben Carson prides himself on not being a politician. Howard Kurtz says, when I spoke with him at length last spring, Carson said he considered the media to be biased, but rather zen about it. Now he seems appalled, and he has made clear his contention at a news conference that he held, of course, there in Florida. For most people, relitigating what happened 50 years ago when Carson was a teenager seems like overkill, and there was a telling moment yesterday on Meet the Press. Asked whether his mother, who Carson says he almost hit with a hammer, couldn't come forward to clarify some of the incidents, the candidate said, "My mother has Alzheimer's." That kind of put things in perspective. But whether the scrutiny is reasonable or overzealous, Carson should recognize this is the price of admission for the people who want to be president. Agree or disagree? Love to certainly focus on that for just a minute. So one aspect, of course, of media bias can come simply when we look at the possibility of reporting things or questioning certain things. But there's another kind of media bias, and that is where, in some cases, a media outlet simply chooses to ignore a story that does not fit their narrative. And this is the piece that comes out now from Robert Knight. He entitles it, How the Media Push Their Super Story. When the people vote, conservative wins tell a different story. And so he says, media bias is less about slanted stories than what's covered or not covered. And one of the examples he uses, if you want to get off the campaign for just a minute, think about the way in which the mainstream media has covered Muslims lately. For example, he says, when a Muslim extremist cut off a woman co-worker's head in Oklahoma City in September, a year ago, there was minimal coverage. A year later, the media went crazy, he says, over a Muslim boy's suspension in Texas for bringing a clock to school that authorities mistook for a bomb. You can see that certainly is one of those cases. But then he goes through and looks at this election that we've just had in November, and we see that, for example, a lot of the stories either did not get covered or they were covered in a fairly small way. Let's look at the case that we've talked about a little bit this last week in Houston, where the voters in Houston overwhelmingly defeated a homosexual transgender non-discrimination proposition. And, at the time, I wondered how it would be covered. And frankly, some media outlets mentioned it, ran on, never talked about it again. But others, of course, cited it as an example of hate winning over compassion. I think what it was a number of voters began to realize how important these local elections were, and they understood what was going on when we saw that the mayor of Houston tried to actually subpoena the sermons of pastors who worked to try to get this proposition on the ballot in the first place. And of course, once the proposition went on the ballot, it went to defeat. You can move from Houston to Kentucky. I know we have a number of listeners in Kentucky. And again, the mainstream media did cover the fact that there is going to be a new governor, Tea Party favorite Matt Bevin, but they didn't really report on the reason for it. I mean, some simply ignored it, simply saw it as an outlier, but let's recognize that here is an individual that was told really by not only the establishment media, but by others to really avoid a lot of the social issues. Not only did he not avoid them, he embraced the social issues. He even went so far as to visit Kim Davis. You might remember her. She was the city clerk who refused to issue same-sex marriage licenses with her name on their certificate. And so you've got those stories. He talks about, of course, the pro-sanctuary San Francisco sheriff that was defeated, and a number of other examples. So media bias can show up in two ways. Number one, it can show up, as we just talked about in a minute, of actually having misleading headlines or only covering part of the story and not bringing any kind of balance. And certainly the Ben Carson story fits into that category. But you can also have media bias, as Robert Knight reminds us, by simply not covering a story that doesn't fit your narrative. So if you'd like to join our conversation, let's open up the phones. 1-800-351-1212. Have a lot more to talk about. Of course, there's a protest there at the University of Missouri. That's something we can talk about. Learned a little bit more about what's happening with ISIS, so we certainly have much more to talk about, but we'd also love to talk with you. So if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take your calls right after this.
When you're driving, it's important to keep your eyes on the road ahead, but once in a while, checking that rearview mirror, not a bad idea. As we look back on last week and our special Truth Team event, a big thank you if you were one of the many to join us. All of those opportunities to double your donation, we met each and every one, and for that, we thank you. Bottom line, though there's no time to rest, the week was a success thanks to your partnership. From Kirby, Penna, all of our guests, Brad Fisk, who joined us on the air, our president, Warren Kelly, thank you for being part of the team. If you were on vacation or procrastinated, or you're just passive-aggressive and refuse to do what you're asked, well, it's never too late to join. You can still be part of this very important team by visiting pointofview.net. Click on the link near the top right of the page that says Become a Monthly Partner. Select your donation amount and welcome aboard to the Truth Team. Pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again,
is Kirby Anderson. I'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212, giving you an opportunity to speak on this issue of media bias or the campaign. Of course, we're going to get into some other topics in just a few minutes. University of Missouri, lots of issues surfacing there, especially when the football team decided to raise awareness by actually at least the African-American players saying they would not play in another game. It looks like the president's going to step down, and we'll talk about some of the demands in just a few minutes. A little bit later, we'll be talking with Newt Gingrich, his book Duplicity. It gets into the issue of terrorism. We'll talk about ISIS then, and also I'll be talking with Callista Gingrich a little bit later about her book, Christmas in America. So lots to talk about, but we also want to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to North Carolina first. Nancy, thank you for joining the conversation today.
Thank you. My question is, why doesn't the media go after Donald Trump? His past is very checkered, and yet they just skim over it. When the issue of the bankruptcy 4 times came up, he said, well, I used the existing laws, and they just went right over it. They didn't delve into it or any of the other things. And the other thing, Marco Rubio, he's being chastised because of some personal issues. But, get with these candidates and get with the issues, not their personal lives, but the issues. That's my take on everything.
Sure. And again, I think I always look at about 4 different issues. Character is one of those. So I certainly applaud investigating so that you learn something about a person's character. But I also want to know where they stand on the issues. It would be nice if I also agreed with them theologically, at least generally. And most importantly, especially for some of these that have never served in political office before, who are they going to appoint to their administration? So I want to look at their stand on the issues. I want to know who they're going to have as part of their cabinet, because they can't be experts in everything. And I would like to know a little bit about their character, and I'd like to know a little bit about their faith. All of those questions are relevant, but your point is well taken. Right now, there's just this incredible scrutiny on the life of Ben Carson, which is maybe appropriate. It certainly hasn't been done in the past. And, of course, they've talked a little bit about some of the financial issues of Marco Rubio, but maybe it's just those are the stories they're surfacing. But I'm a little bit puzzled by why he's been given this level of scrutiny, given the fact that he has yet to even win one delegate, and up until recently was not exactly the front runner. Why not look at some of the things of Donald Trump? Go ahead.
Yeah, he's being chastised, and all this is done because he's a believer. And
I think because he's African American too. If you're a black conservative, they come after you. Let's face it. Clarence Thomas, J.C. Watts. We can go down this long, long list, of individuals. That is certainly the case. Okay, well, Nancy,
America,
thanks for
wise up.
Well, thanks for calling in. Thanks for starting us off here. Let's give a few more of you a chance to join the conversation today. Let's go to Angela in Georgia. What would you like to add to the conversation today?
Yes, hi, and thank you. What I would like to add is the media bias. I have been in litigation for more than 15 years in reference to federal officials, government officials, U.S. attorneys, assistant U.S. attorneys that have taken an oath of office and refused to perform the duties of their position. And whereas we have the lady Kim, the city clerk, that
Kim
refused
Davis,
to...
Yeah, she didn't want to have her name on that, and we're going after her. And there are, as you said, other people that have not actually fulfilled the duties of their office, and we don't even know their names, and nobody's actually being prosecuted in some cases.
Exactly, and that's the purpose of me calling in. And the media refuses to report this. Now, the statutes that these officials violated is specifically states that you will be fined and you will be required to serve time. However, this lady. The bottom line is, if you took an oath in office, you're required to perform the duties of your position. I can respect that, and I can accept that. That's why I filed the lawsuits for civil actions. But how is it that you can put this lady in jail, and you as a U.S. attorney, assistant U.S. attorney, as well as head of federal agencies, took an oath of office, violate the federal statutes daily, and nothing happens, and the media refuses to report it?
Well, again, I appreciate you calling in. We are having a little trouble hearing what you're saying, but I think most of you picked it up. And that is, we have individuals that are not fulfilling the duties of their office, and you don't even know their names. They are not even part of a, quote, scandal or anything else. But again, there is a particular focus on Kim Davis because it had to do with the issue, of course, of a marriage license. And, of course, gay activists were going to make a big deal about it, and they did as well. So again, let's, if we can, give some more of you a chance to join the conversation today. 1-800-351-1212. We've talked about certainly the way in which the media has covered recently Ben Carson, and we're looking primarily at CNN and a little bit of the Wall Street Journal, but mostly Politico. But then the other story, of course, that came out by Robert Knight is how, in some cases, the mainstream media has ignored some of the stories of the obvious trend here, sort of, if you will, the pushback against some of the issues that we've discussed so often here on Point of View, whether you look at the vote in Houston, whether you look at the vote in Kentucky or others. And let's head out to Wyoming. KCMI and Eric, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. People have been saying, and I've heard this from several people, that Carson running for president, which I support Carson, but I've heard through other people that his wife works for the UN, and questions are saying that if he becomes president, he can use his wife to get into the United Nations and get some things done that he thinks is politically correct, which I disagree with. I think that's not the truth, but what do you think about that?
Well, first of all, even as you're talking here, I'm typing in, I happen to know her, Candy Carson, have met her, and of course have interviewed Ben Carson a number of times. I'm not so sure I know that she works for the United Nations. So that's the first kind of question mark that I have with your question, obviously. If she does, I can't say that she works in an official capacity. Maybe she's done something in a volunteer effort, but maybe some others know more about it. But again, this is the difficulty when you come, in some respects, into the political process and there's never been any vetting. These kinds of questions about, for example, the wife of Ted Cruz. Well, we know a fair amount about where she worked and those kinds of things, and in some respects because he had to run as a senator. Marco Rubio, the same way. Of course, some of the governors, that's the same issue. So you know more about the various aspects of their lives. And over the last couple of weeks, we've had people calling in and saying, well, somebody in his staff has done this, or, well, it would be important, I think, for Ben Carson to explain any of that. But this is the first I've heard anybody saying that Candy Carson, his wife, actually works for the United Nations. So until I hear some more, I guess I'll just have to put that one on hold. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. And I think we have to be careful that it's not just media. We also have to understand that people want to do things to hurt people just because they don't like that type of a person.
Yes. And so again, we'll kind of vet some of those issues as well. We'll find out. And again, this is one of the very important functions of the primary process. And before we've even had our first caucus or primary, we're having, in a sense, a vetting that's taking place in the debate. And we have another debate, of course, taking place this week. And so there's one more opportunity to have a chance to get some very important questions asked and answered. And I'm sure that tomorrow night we'll get a chance to hear from some of those individuals about that. Let's go back to the phones in New Hampshire. WSEW. Vinny, thank you for calling today.
Yes, hi, Kirby. Thank you so much for your program. I really do enjoy it.
Thank you.
I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts. As far as the media goes, I think it's perfectly appropriate for the media to vet candidates. It would be nice if there was some semblance of fairness in that process.
That's all I'm asking for. If you ask those questions of Ben Carson, you should ask him about Obama. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, when 8 years ago, if the media asked the same kinds of questions of Barack Obama, I can't even imagine how many times the race card would have been pulled.
There you go.
And on top of that, the way the media handles these debates, I don't know why the media can't ask the same questions on Democratic debates as they ask on Republican debates. Why does it have to get personal and
let's compare the questions asked tomorrow night on November 10th to what happens 4 days later on November 14th, and see if we see any similarity.
Why can't we just ask the same question?
Yes,
but, we should have important questions that should be asked of any presidential candidate, regardless of party affiliation.
Good point.
So that's all I wanted to share.
You shared some good things, and since I'm coming to a break, we'll stop right there. Those of you on hold, just wait, because we will be back in just a few minutes. And again, you will find some articles we've posted here today. And of course, my commentaries on some of these issues are also something that you might want to have access to. When we come back, we'll continue talking about media bias, move into what's happening at the University of Missouri. All that coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's focus a little bit of attention in the University of Missouri. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be in Missouri tomorrow, so I've already been thinking about some of this. And as you may know, there have been a series of demands that have been issued by what are called Concerned Students 1950, 8 different demands. The top 2 have to do with the president, Tim Wolf, who has now said that he is going to resign. But there's a lot of other issues at stake. So let's, if we can, focus on what is happening right there in Columbia, Missouri, at the University of Missouri, and we'll go to Ruth in Missouri to maybe speak to that issue. Ruth, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Kirby, for having me. I am a Missouri alum, and so I was But I don't know all the particulars of what's going on with that, but I am just sick and tired of all of the perceived bias that goes on. And one of the comments I read in something I was reading on it yesterday said, why don't they apply the same thing to it that Reagan did to the air traffic controllers when they all decided to go out on strike? And I'm about of the same opinion. As far as that guy on the hunger strike, just let him starve.
Well, I don't want anybody to starve, but what you're talking about is one of the graduate students went on a hunger strike, and then let me just educate all of our listeners. A graduate student went on a hunger strike. Then the real thing that made this, in some respects, you got to appreciate how sports so often is used to get people's attention. It's when the African American football players at the University of Missouri said that they would not play another game, and they didn't even practice yesterday, as I understand, said that they wouldn't until the president resigned. That sort of became a much more significant national issue. But Ruth, I'll give you a final word here on some other comments. Since you're an alum, what do you think about what's going on right there at your old alma mater?
Well, actually, I've got a lot of other objections to the University of Missouri besides the perceived racial discrimination. I am so disgusted with their multicultural and their transgenderism acceptance and all of that I just quit supporting the alumni because of those issues.
Yep, and you might get more of it now because obviously this is having to do with African American. But if you read between the lines, I'm going to read this in just a minute, you get the sense that this is going to push more of the other agenda besides just because, again, you can see how often when people are speaking about civil rights, which are certainly important issues for African American students, Hispanic American, whatever, Asian students, oftentimes homosexuals say, well, me too. And so you're going to see, I think, with some of those demands, and I'll read a few of them in just a few minutes here for everybody to hear. If you thought you had multiculturalism now on some of these major universities, you're going to see it even more so. And so let me maybe just take a minute to read those. And, you know, as somebody that grew up during the turbulent 1960s, I remember some of these demands being made at the University of California at Berkeley, at Columbia University, and some others. Now, there are 8 demands. I'm not going to read all of them, but here you can see there's all sorts of issues just with the kind of demands that this group, Concerned Student 1950, put out. We demand that the University of Missouri creates and enforces comprehensive racial awareness and inclusion curriculum. Okay, racial awareness, that's, of course, black and white. Inclusion, you know what that means. That's homosexuality and transgenderism. But anyway, enforces comprehensive racial awareness and inclusion curriculum throughout its campus departments and units, mandatory for all students, faculty, staff, and administration. This curriculum must be vetted, maintained, and overseen by a board comprised of students, staff, and faculty of color. And they want this curriculum in every department at the university. You can see a math professor going, really? A physics professor saying, how am I supposed to do this? You know, engineering professor going, this doesn't even fit to what we're talking about. Let's take another one. We demand that the academic year of 2017 and 2018, by that time, the University of Missouri increases the percentage of black faculty and staff campus-wide to 10%. Now, I think always there is a desire to have diversity, but when you start establishing a quota, we saw what has happened in major universities. University of Texas at Austin, a good example, where they looked for a long time. I remember in one department, I believe it was the biology department, that they wanted an individual with these credentials, and the only person that could actually fulfill that particular role as a professor had to be an African American. When they could not find anybody, they simply said, we will not fill that position. And that's what happens when you start listing quotas. You hope that eventually we could get to the point where we would have a colorblind society and where individuals that have superior academic credentials, whatever their race, color, creed, they would actually be the ones that actually are put in that position on the university. One more, we demand the University of Missouri comprises a strategic 10-year plan that will increase retention rates for marginalized students, sustain diversity curriculum and training, and promote a more safe and inclusive campus. All for the idea of a safe and inclusive campus, but again, retention rates for marginalized students. at a time when we have great inflation, maybe the question we should ask is, should we not allow some students to go to college in the first place because they do not have the prior academic preparation for them to succeed? And if they went to another university or another college where the academic requirements are not so stringent, they would then have a chance of graduating and thus do better in society. But again, you can see how a lot of this is certainly motivated by quotas and kind of race baiting. And of course, like I said, it doesn't just talk about racial awareness. It also talks about inclusive curriculum. And I think we know what that possibly means as well. So we'll see how this plays out. The president, Tim Wolf, is resigning, and we'll see, I fear, for the next person that gets into that position, what is the next step at the University of Missouri. And if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Georgia this time, WAGP. Larry, what would you like to add to the conversation today?
Yes, sir. I was listening to you more on the racial, or the bias of the,
go for it. Yes.
The media. And I noticed that there seems to be a bias in every aspect of reporting, whether it is in race and sex or anything. They always have a bias. And I want to ask you, what could possibly be the motive for a news reporting group to have a bias in the first place?
Well, let's face it, all of us have a bias. I mean, I admit mine because, I come in here with a Christian worldview. So that's really definitely a bias. And I certainly recognize that the way I apply a Christian view to various issues of life is biased. So everybody has a bias, but I think if you're going to try to have something that is fair, you recognize that there is an alternative viewpoint. But if indeed everybody in the newsroom comes from the same universities, they come from the same kind of philosophical worldview. And you can go into newsrooms and never even find a person that would call themselves a conservative. You can go into newsrooms and never find anybody that's ever voted in a Republican primary. Well, okay, then you recognize that the whole bias of the newsroom is going to go left. And so in some respects, individuals in that newsroom don't even know that they have a bias, because everybody they know thinks and believes pretty much the same way they do. And it's best illustrated by one of my favorite stories that came out of the New York Times many, many years ago. When Richard Nixon was elected in 1968, it was heard in the newsroom in the New York Times. A person said, "I don't know how Richard Nixon was elected. I don't know anybody of my friends that ever voted for him." Well, that's the point. I mean, they live in a very, very different world. The media elite are those individuals that are primarily from the East Coast. Most of them are from New York or New Jersey or Pennsylvania. They actually live together. They work together. They dine together. They live in a very different world than you and me. And as a result, they really don't even understand kind of mainstream America. So that's part of this issue of bias. Well, when we come back, Newt Gingrich will be with us, then Callista Gingrich, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some of these other issues in the news. All that coming up right after these important messages.
This time of year, it seems everyone's looking for a better, more affordable healthcare solution. But with costs rising and options limited, where do you turn? If you're a Christian, you turn to Medishare. It's not insurance. It's over 154,000 believers who share each other's medical bills. It's about half the cost of healthcare insurance programs. And it's fully acceptable under the law. Best of all, Medishare is based on the timeless principles found in God's Word. You never pay for things that go against your beliefs. Medishare is healthcare that fits your family and your faith.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your health care. For your free information guide, call 844-45-BIBLE. Not available in Montana. Medishare, affordable biblical health care. Call 844-45-BIBLE. That's 844-45-BIBLE.
A big thank you to members of Truth Team 360. You make this program possible. Not a member yet? Join today at pointofview.net. Click on Donate Now and become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kirby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View.
And now, Kirby Anderson.
Second hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Newt Gingrich is going to be with us. Originally, I thought he was going to be on right now, but he'll be on in about a half an hour, so we'll have a chance to chat with him about his new book, Duplicity. And I might just mention that the premise of the book is fighting terrorism, and so I thought for just a few minutes before he joins us, we might talk about this issue and how that all fits together, because what we are talking about, of course, is a Middle East that is almost on fire. At least that's what some have said. And we have an ongoing conflict. We have this incredible rise of ISIS. And so I wanted to try to put this in some perspective. And even from a biblical perspective, there have been some that have said, when we see what is happening in the Middle East today, it does look like this coalition that is described in Ezekiel 38 actually may be coming about. Now, it's possible that this coalition may not come about for our lifetime, but it is kind of intriguing that these particular players in the coalition, which oftentimes in the past did not work together, are working now. And so this may not say that this particular battle of Gog and Magog may not happen in the next few days, weeks, years, even whatever, but it is quite possible that at least we're seeing, if you will, the pieces of the chessboard beginning to come together in ways that never made any sense. Recognize that this coalition comes against Israel, and it wasn't until 1948 that you had Jews back in the land in Israel. And so when you read Ezekiel 38, it talks about this battle, which has not happened yet. So it is obviously a prophecy about something in the future. And since it has not taken place, many people say that it's probably going to take place in the future. When you look at the names, though, it's a little bit hard to sort out. So I thought I would do that for just a minute, because it talks about names like Rosh and Magog and Persia and Cush and Put. And you go, okay, what are those? Well, it turns out that those are the names of the regions at the time in which the prophecy was given in the book of Ezekiel. We have to translate those into modern times. Rosh, for example, is Russia, not just simply because the name sounds like that, but you can go and find where those tribes were, and that would be what we today would call present-day Russia. Then Magog is kind of in Central Asia. That could be a lot of the Stan countries, which are Muslim countries, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan and things of that nature. Then you see Meshech and Tubal. Well, that fits the region today, which oftentimes is called Asia Minor or Turkey. Persia, that's an easy one, actually, because up until 1935, Iran was called Persia. And even to this day, we talk about Persians living in Iran. Cush is oftentimes identified with Sudan or sometimes Ethiopia. Put, well, that's the ancient name for what today we call Libya. And then some of the others, Gomer and Beth Togarmah, those would be areas which today we also identify as the nation of Turkey. Now, as we go through that list, you notice something very interesting now, don't you? With the exception of Russia, these are all Muslim countries. And some of these are located where there is also a great deal of conflict. And the idea is that some of these individuals and some of these particular nations come against Israel. And as they do, we can see a battle forming. So first of all, we've seen very clearly how many of these Muslim countries have actually been critical of Israel and could come against Israel. But then second of all, add to this something we'll talk about a little bit with Newt Gingrich in just a few minutes, and that is the rise of ISIS. ISIS is actually sort of, if you will, a subset of Al-Qaeda. And actually, Al-Qaeda disenfranchised ISIS because they disagreed over their tactics. And then this sort of power vacuum that existed in Syria and even in Iraq after especially we left, but even during the battle, ISIS was able to really be able to bring together their forces. And so as a result, ISIS, which stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, is now, many people believe, the richest terrorist group that exists, and it occupies a very large portion of territory. As a matter of fact, it now controls territory as large, really, as an entire nation state. From Mosul, which is actually the ancient city of Nineveh to the north, all the way down to at least Fallujah, which is somewhat to the west of Baghdad, and into various aspects of Syria. And if it weren't for the fact that you have the Iraqi army holding the ground a little bit against them to the east, and more importantly, the battle of the Kurdish military, known as the Peshmerga, to the northeast, they would have even controlled more land. And so we are talking about the kind of influence today that ISIS has, and of course the great concern that we've had about what that means to many of the Christians that have lived there. If you have been out on your Facebook page, you'll see sometimes this particular symbol that looks like a dot with a U, and actually that's the Arabic symbol for N, or for Nazarene. That's a pejorative Middle Eastern term that's used for Christians. And oftentimes when ISIS would come into a community, they would mark the houses of the Christians with this N for Nazarene, just as you might remember the Nazi soldiers did so when they would go into a region and they would mark the homes of Jews with a Star of David. And so in some respects now you've had Christians that have actually worked very hard to try to show support to those who have been disenfranchised. When we talk about the influence here, of course, this is perhaps one of the most brutal of all terrorist organizations. They've sold women as sex slaves. They've beheaded men and women and children. They've captured, burned alive captives and all the rest. But as I've pointed out as well, they have a tremendous amount of power and control a great deal of territory. And one of the questions that certainly we have talked about even this last week with Louis Gohmert, and perhaps we'll have a chance to talk today with Newt Gingrich about, is, what can we do? We're not going to put many boots on the ground. Of course, the president the other day sent 50 troops over there. But again, the rules of engagement prevent them from really being able to have any kind of meaningful interaction. And of course, the real question is, what can we do and what should we do? But when we take a break, I want to come back and maybe try to explain why we have ISIS in the first place and why we find ourselves right now where the Middle East is in such turmoil. In some respects, the Middle East has always been in turmoil, but the kind of turmoil we've seen in Egypt over the last few years, even the turmoil we see in Turkey, and most importantly, the growth of ISIS came about for some very good reasons. And a lot of this can be found in a very good book that we've done interviews on, and you can even go back and listen to those interviews on our website, pointofview.net, with Charles Dyer, called The ISIS Crisis. But I'm going to come back and try real quickly to at least identify what he calls 5 dots. Look at the 5 dots, the 5 kind of spots in history that help us understand how we went from a time in which maybe there was only a conflict between Russia and the Taliban in Afghanistan to a full-fledged series of conflicts around the Middle East and what that means for the future. So a little bit of history lesson when we come back, and then, of course, we're going to talk with Newt Gingrich about his new book, Duplicity, and then we'll be talking with also his wife, Callista Gingrich, a little bit later about her book, Christmas in America. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Universities talk a great deal about free speech, but they have been clamping down on speech they don't like for many years. When I first started speaking on college campuses in the mid-1970s, I was impressed that professors would invite a Christian speaker into the classroom. Sometimes they would even say to the class, "You have heard my views on this subject. In the interest of academic freedom, I wanted to give you a chance to hear a Christian's view on this subject." In the late 1980s, I noticed that political correctness was taking over and opportunities in the classroom waned. In fact, university administrators often warned faculty not to have outside speakers in the classroom. Soon this applied not only to Christian speakers, but any speaker, like a conservative, that wasn't deemed politically correct. Sadly, students have accepted this situation as normal and normative. Young America's Foundation, working with a polling company, surveyed 1,000 college students about their attitude towards free speech. They found that students generally supported the abstract idea of free speech, but rejected the idea if the speech is not politically correct. They agree with the proposition that undergraduate education should include a diversity of opinion, but when that diversity included conservative ideas, support dropped significantly. This may sound confused and contradictory, but David French in a recent column says that he doesn't think students are confused at all. Perhaps they're good learners. Colleges by word and deed teach students that there is free speech, the speech that they value enough to protect, and not speech, the expression they really don't like. He's correct. University students have learned their lesson. Free speech is speech they like, and everything else does not deserve protection. That is why they allow universities to promote speech codes and protect them from free speech that they will soon experience once they graduate from college. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talking about terrorism in the Middle East at the moment, because that is one of the themes out of this new book by Newt Gingrich, Duplicity. It's fiction, but it fits a little too well with what is happening in the world, and I thought just for a moment I might give you a little bit of background history, since I originally thought he was going to join us, and now will be joining us in about 15 minutes. But one of the things I wanted to talk about is how we ended up in the world that we find ourselves right now. And I think probably one of the better pieces that I've ever read is by Charles Dyer, and you can actually go to our website, pointofview.net, type in Charles Dyer, his book, ISIS Crisis, and hear the interview I did with him. But let me kind of summarize it real quickly, because a lot of us wonder, how did we get here? What happened? And maybe there's some lessons to learn about how to get out of the circumstances we find ourselves in. And so what he has is kind of 5 dots. And if you're taking some notes, you might just number 1 to 5 real simply, and we'll take you through those. Dot number 1 goes all the way back to the 1970s, and this is where Russia actually invaded Afghanistan. And for those of us that are a little bit older, we remember that led to all sorts of controversy. As a matter of fact, it was so controversial that then President Jimmy Carter canceled the American participation in the Olympics in Russia. And so there was a battle that was fought between those in Afghanistan, and many of those were jihadists, but we didn't really identify them as such, but they were known as the Mujahideen. For those of you that like movies, you can go back and you can find a movie that involved James Bond about the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. You can find a Rambo movie about the Mujahideen. But one of the leaders of the Mujahideen is a man that we do know, Osama bin Laden. And so in some respects, as he and others were fighting against the Russians, they were able to gain some kind of military prowess and expertise. And so that brings us to dot number 2, and that is Russia eventually left Afghanistan defeated. And so there was a power vacuum, and that power vacuum in Afghanistan was filled by what was called the Taliban. The Taliban is the word, Pashtun word for students. And these were individuals who were students of a very radical form of Islam in Pakistan. And they came in and implemented, after Soviet domination ended, rule over those in Afghanistan that was very brutal. I mean, there was an attempt to bring this nation back to really the 7th century. Women could not go to school. You could perhaps even be executed if you played Western music, flying a kite. I mean, it was just a brutal regime. But in the midst of that, the leader who seized power is a man by the name of Muhammad Omar. And he, as a result, allowed Osama bin Laden to come back into the country and build Al-Qaeda and actually have various training camps, terrorist training camps. And those existed for some time. As a matter of fact, those of you that might have been around when President Bill Clinton was in office, you might remember that at one point he actually fired missiles into Afghanistan and other places in the Middle East to try to disrupt and even kill Osama bin Laden. Well, that leads to dot number 3. And that is this Al-Qaeda that was developing now in Afghanistan and other countries. Al-Qaeda means the base, and that was sort of the base of operations, and those base of operations now allow them to carry out various attacks. These were attacks on Saudi Arabia, for example, and you might remember the attacks on our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. But perhaps the most devastating attack happened on 9/11. And on that particular day, this is when we recognized how indeed threatening Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda was. Which leads now to dot number 4. And that is that once, first of all, President George W. Bush sent troops into Afghanistan and later into Iraq, you have then Al-Qaeda becoming more of almost like a franchise operation where each particular Al-Qaeda group had its own kind of autonomy, and the leader of the group in Iraq was a man by the name of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Zarqawi was one of those individuals that we wanted to kill along with Osama bin Laden, and eventually he was indeed killed. I believe it was through a drone attack. And that leads to dot number 5, the final one, and that is when Zarqawi was killed. Then in the midst of this sort of loose coalition of fighters came together under ISIS, the Islamic State of Syria and Iraq, and under the leadership of a man by the name of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and he is the leader of the Islamic State. And it's, I think, important to recognize that a lot of what we talk about in dot 5 happened during the so-called Arab Spring. For those of you, even if you're relatively young, you might remember when there was this real hope that we would see in the Arab Spring students rising up in Egypt and really want to implement democratic values, but instead actually enacted a way in which the Muslim Brotherhood took over, and we saw these kinds of reactions in Libya and also in Turkey and other places. And so this, I think, gives you a little bit of an understanding of how we got to where we are. The jihadists today hold to a view that most Muslims have held to if they were strictly reading the Quran from a maybe jihadist point of view or from a literal point of view, and that is they divide the world into 2 spheres. The House of Islam, called the Dar al-Islam, and the House of War, Dar al-Harb. The House of Islam are the nations under the control of Muslims, where Sharia law is enforced, and the House of War are the nations that are not under Muslim control and do not submit to Sharia. And according to this jihadist interpretation of Islam, there will be a constant conflict between the House of Islam and the House of War until the House of War is transformed into the House of Islam. In other words, they have, if you will, an eschatology, a view of the end times, in which they believe that all the land will be conquered for Allah, and that there will then be a global Islamic state known as the Caliphate, and then Sharia law will be implemented in that particular way. So this is sort of the goal of the jihadists. And so it is, I think, very concerning if we do not understand the kind of mindset that these people fight with. Some of them are terrorist groups that have sort of a quasi territory like ISIS. Others are those that actually control territory. Let's look at maybe now the Shiite Muslims in Iran. And one of the things that we've talked about with all sorts of guests on this program, from Joel Rosenberg to Gary Bauer to Michelle Bachmann to Louis Gohmert, to mention just a few, and many, many others, Robert Spencer, these are individuals that say we don't really have the same kind of set of circumstances that we had, say, during the Cold War. The philosophy was back then that Russia knew that if they fired a nuclear weapon at America, that we would retaliate with nuclear weapons. That was deterrence. It was called mutually assured destruction. So they did not dare fire a nuclear weapon. However, let's, if we can, go to Tehran for just a minute. The previous leader, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, or the current leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, they actually believe that a military confrontation, maybe even a global conflict, will usher in the return of what's called the 12th Imam, or the Mahdi. So as the Russians were less likely in the Soviet Union to fire a missile because of deterrence, there is much less of a hesitation on the part of Iran. And so when you look at this Iranian nuclear deal, you can see that that is a real concern. And as we'll see as we talk with Newt Gingrich in just a minute about his book, some of the concerns about terrorist activity are also illustrative of the fact that we're dealing with a different set of circumstances than we were just a few decades ago. And this is why it's going to take a lot of wisdom on the part of our leaders to make sure that we make good, sound military as well as diplomatic decisions. So let's take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk first with Newt Gingrich about his new book. It is entitled Duplicity, and it's one that is going to obviously get us talking about this whole issue of terrorism. And I'm sure he'll have a few comments. I'm sure I can ask him one or two about this upcoming debate and the debate format. Then we'll be talking with Callista Gingrich a little bit later about her new book, Christmas in America. And if you'd like to know more about either of their books or about them, you can go to our website, pointofview.net. We also, of course, today have my commentary, Speech on Campus, talking about free speech and how many young people today on campus say, well, I believe in free speech, but they sort of believe in it in an abstract way. But when it comes to whether or not Christian values, Christian ideas, conservative values or ideas, well, they're not so big on free speech. And in some respects, they've learned the lessons well of what is happening on college campuses. We talked a little bit about that at the University of Missouri, but let's come back and spend some time talking with the former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. All that coming up right after this.
When you're driving, it's important to keep your eyes on the road ahead, but once in a while, checking that rearview mirror, not a bad idea. As we look back on last week and our special Truth Team event, a big thank you if you were one of the many to join us. All of those opportunities to double your donation, we met each and every one, and for that, we thank you. Bottom line, though there's no time to rest, the week was a success thanks to your partnership. From Kirby, Penna, all of our guests, Brad Fisk, who joined us on the air, our president, Warren Kelly, thank you for being part of the team. If you were on vacation or procrastinated or you're just passive-aggressive and refuse to do what you're asked, well, it's never too late to join. You can still be part of this very important team by visiting pointofview.net. Click on the link near the top right of the page that says Become a Monthly Partner. Select your donation amount and welcome aboard to the Truth Team. Pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Joined now by the former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. We just talked a little bit about some of the history that brought us to this point as we talk about terrorism, a possible attack on an embassy, and much more. Newt Gingrich not only served as, of course, Speaker of the House, but also as a candidate for the Republican nomination of president, is now currently a Fox News contributor, but also the author of 27 different books, some which are fiction, others that are nonfiction. And we've talked about in the past books like A Nation Like No Other, Rediscovering God in America, Winning the Future, and the newest one, Duplicity, a Washington thriller. Mr. Speaker, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, it's great to be with you, and both Callista and I were really looking forward to this chance to chat with you, Kirby.
Well, and we will have Callista on in just a minute. We have a video by her. We're going to talk about her new book out called Christmas in America that joins, of course, Ellis and all of the other things that we'll be talking about. Some of the previous ones, of course, were Sweet Land of Liberty, Land of Pilgrims, Pride, Yankee Doodle Dandy, and this one on Christmas. But for just a minute, Duplicity. Okay, you have sort of a Benghazi attack on an embassy in Mogadishu in Somalia. I thought it's kind of intriguing because it takes us sort of to Benghazi, but also what would it be like if a president decided, let's put an embassy back in Somalia? First of all, does that make any sense? Because obviously that's the premise that begins the book. And I think there are some obvious links to what is happening today in terms of our foreign policy.
Well, there are a couple key points to Duplicity and why I decided that telling the story as a novel would be more powerful. One is we want to make the case that terrorism is a worldwide phenomenon and that it is like a virus being spread by the Internet. You'll notice, by the way, the major al-Qaeda terrorist was just picked up in Europe trying to smuggle in as a refugee. Mm-hmm. And that for several days, the European media did not want to report it because they're afraid it would lead people to be anti-refugee. But it's a fact. These people are all over the place. And so in Duplicity, we have a Somali American in Minneapolis who's a total patriot who is running for Congress while his brother is in Somalia as a leader, the number 2 leader in a terrorist organization. Imagine that tension. Then we have a president who decides that she has to prove she's tough. And I'm not saying whether this is a Carly Fiorina or this is a Hillary Clinton, but we deliberately picked a female president running for re-election. And to prove she's tough, she's going to reopen the embassy in Somalia in a bold gesture, which violates all of the national security concerns that people are warning her about. And it blows up, and in the process, because it's close to an election, they decide they have to lie about it. And so when the president lies about it, that puts pressure on the CIA to back up the president. So the CIA ends up lying to Congress, which is against the law, and you get into a very interesting, complex story.
Yes, and again, with Sally Allworth, who's the president, I mean, it's thinly veiled, but it certainly raises some very important questions we see in the headlines today.
That's exactly right. We had no idea. We started writing this in June of 2013. We had no idea it would come out the same month as Secretary Clinton would testify to the Benghazi Committee. And, of course, every day that goes by, we learn new things. But the key point here, as we just learned with the bombing of the Russian airplane in the Sinai, is that this is a worldwide threat, that Islamic supremacists are all over the place, that they're growing through the Internet, that they are recruiting, and that they are extraordinarily dangerous, and that the danger is growing, it's not waning.
Have we lost you?
No, I'm here.
Okay. And see, one of the questions I wanted to certainly focus on is that internet connection. James Comey at the FBI and some others have talked about, this is maybe why we're getting the lone wolves and others. It used to be that if you wanted to be a jihadist, you'd have to go to Afghanistan, you'd have to go to Somalia, Sudan, or something like that. But now you can actually recruit individuals simply by having them sit in their computer and learn and begin to be radicalized right wherever they might be, whether in this country or other countries around the world.
Sure, and it spawns copycats like the student in California who went out and knifed, I think it was 4 people.
Yes.
Almost certainly is a copycat for what they're seeing happen in Israel. So you have this entire worldwide phenomenon, and you have the Western elites who just rigorously try to avoid thinking about it. So, you had Secretary Clinton, President Obama saying oh, the attack in Benghazi was because of this fairly stupid video that this guy made.
Yes.
When everybody was telling them it wasn't true. You have the Army refusing to accept that the major who killed 13 people at Fort Hood while yelling Allahu Akbar and having a card in his wallet that said Soldier of Allah may have been motivated by his Islamist beliefs. And there's this whole effort to reject the reality of this worldwide movement.
One of the premises of your book, and it's really foundational, is the fact that these different groups, these terrorist groups, are actually coordinated. And I think there's a question that I think a lot of our listeners have, that you have Al-Qaeda, you have ISIS, you have Hamas, you have Hezbollah, you have Islamic Jihad, you have all these different groups, but they, you would assume, are acting independently. You put this as a fictional element in the book, but what about that idea of there being coordination with these various terrorist groups?
Well, if you think of coordination rather than control, there's no question they learn from each other. I was very infuriated when the State Department under Secretary Clinton for 4 years refused to say Boko Haram in Nigeria was a terrorist organization. And part of their argument was, look, this is a local group, it has no connection. Well, you go back and you read in the American Foreign Policy Council's Dictionary of Islam, which comes out or Almanac of Islam, which comes out every year. When Boko Haram founded its refugee camp, it was called Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
Now they're sitting here in Nigeria and West Africa, naming their camp Afghanistan in 2001 in honor of the Taliban. Now, how can you not suggest that there is some relationship here between different movements? They're not controlled. It's not like the McDonald's Corporation or something like that, but there is a loose coalition of people all moving in the same direction, all wanting to destroy the West, all wanting to impose a radical medieval version of Islam, and they broadly swap back and forth. And, you know, one year they might be Al-Qaeda, the next year they might be Al-Shabaab, the following year they might be a part of ISIS. And, you know, our technical elites sit around and go, well, now, let's not use the wrong term. Well,
yes.
The term is these are Islamic supremacists who want to destroy the West.
So again, coordination, not control. One other question certainly I wanted to put on the table is you talk about early on in the book that even though this is a work of fiction, the quotes that you use are actual quotes from radical Islamists or jihadists. And I would think that a lot of listeners, Mr. Speaker, have maybe never heard some of those quotes because the mainstream media doesn't quote those. And working their way through this book, they're going to begin to realize how indeed radical and how there is a desire for a universal worldwide caliphate to be implemented so that eventually all of the world will be under Sharia law.
Well, we deliberately were very careful in our quotes because we wanted people to realize none of this, the quotes are not fiction. You have people wandering around the planet who are immersed in the 7th and 8th century, who actually act out things now. Part of the reason they do beheadings is beheadings were a big deal back in the 7th and 8th century. Part of the reason that they believe in slaves is that they had slaves back in the 7th and 8th century. You just go down this list of things and you'll find they are trying to relive some 1,400 years ago and to bring it into the modern era. It's really pretty sobering.
It is. Again, the book is entitled Duplicity. We have information about it on our website. We have a book review of it, and we also have, of course, links to Newt Gingrich's organization and all the things that you would probably want to have in terms of understanding that. So, again, you can go to gingrichproductions.com. We have all the links there. But just before we take a break, and then I'm going to talk with Callista, I thought you might speak to this issue of the debate tomorrow night. There have been a lot of individuals that have been very frustrated with the format of the debate. As a presidential candidate, any suggestions on what we could do to improve those debates?
I think we're going to be pleasantly surprised. I think that Fox Business has made an absolute commitment that they're going to focus on issues. They're going to ask substantive questions. I think there will not be a whole bunch of gotcha questions tomorrow night. And I think, frankly, they want to set a standard that you'll be able to compare with the disaster of the CNBC debate, and you'll be proud of what Fox Business Channel is doing. And I say that having talked to a number of them about their plans. They really are taking seriously elevating this next debate to a policy debate focused on big questions.
Good. That makes me want to watch it. After the last one, I wasn't. It was really hard to make her way through it. So we're going to take a break, and we're going to talk with your wife in just a minute. Book is, again, entitled Duplicity, a Washington thriller. And when we come back, we're going to talk with Callista Gingrich. And, of course, she is the president of Gingrich Productions. And the book is entitled Christmas in America. And we're going to learn a little bit more about Ellis the elephant and also about Christmas in the White House. Let's take a break. When we come back, we have posted all sorts of information. We have information about Newt Gingrich, information about his book, a book review as well. Then we have information about Callista's new book and the video that she did, and we encourage you to watch the video, maybe put it on your Facebook page and educate some others. We'll be back right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and we've talked, of course, with Newt Gingrich about his new book, Duplicity. We have information about it on our website, as well as a book review. But now we go to Callista Gingrich, and we have her new book as well. We have that information as well as a video that you can watch, and oftentimes we encourage you to watch the video, maybe then put it on your Facebook page, hit that share button. And this is part of a series that we've talked about before. It includes the stories of Ellis the elephant, for example. example, the sweet land of liberty, land of pilgrim's pride, Yankee Doodle Dandy, From Sea to Shining Sea, and this new one, Christmas in America. Callista Gingrich is, of course, the president of Gingrich Productions, as well as produced a number of films like Divine Mercy, The City on a Hill, America at Risk, 9 Days That Changed the World. And, of course, we've also talked about that best-selling book, Rediscovering God in America, and her photography was part of that as well. Callista, thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
Thank you for having us, Kirby.
One of the things that I have appreciated about what you've done is to educate this next generation about our nation's history. Sadly, a lot of young people know nothing about the Pilgrims, nothing about the American Revolution, and of course, even in this one, probably nothing about some of the history of Christmas in our history. And I know that's why you've written so many of these books, to educate a new generation, especially a younger generation, about some of the founding principles of our country.
That's right. It's vitally important that our children have an understanding of our American history, including our founding principles and values. Unfortunately, today, many of our kids are learning revisionist and politically correct history, and as a consequence, really aren't learning the basics about our nation. And today, just 20% of our fourth graders, 17% of our eighth graders, and 12% of our 12th graders are actually at grade level proficiency in American history. So we've got some work to do, and we owe it to our kids to give them the tools they need at a very early age so they can appreciate the greatness of this nation.
You know, your earlier books, of course, focused on a particular period in history, whether it was Sweet Land of Liberty or Land of Pilgrim's Pride or Yankee Doodle Dandy. In some respects, what this one does is it skims the surface and finds various aspects of Christmas in each one of those. But again, Christmas has been very important, whether it was celebrated by the Pilgrims or whether it was during the, if you will, Christmas holiday season of crossing the Delaware, George Washington and others. So there's some very important lessons that we can teach our kids even at Christmas about Americans' history, right?
Absolutely. Christmas in America is the fifth volume in my LSD Elephant series. And as you said, this is a series that offers a guided tour of American history for 4 to 8 year olds. And in my new book, Alice discovers the joy of Christmas and really how this special holiday has been celebrated throughout our nation's history. And America has always been a nation of faith, and throughout our history, people have come here seeking the freedom to worship. And Christmas in America has been celebrated since the very beginning. In fact, the Jamestown colonists actually celebrated Christmas en route to America aboard ships in 1606. So it's so important for our young Americans to really learn how Christmas has become a cherished part of the American experience.
Another one that I might mention, I've been to Williamsburg many times, and actually I'm a supporter of Williamsburg. And, of course, if you've ever been there during the holiday season, during the Christmas season, of course, they talk about Christmas. You have a chapter on that. Of course, I mentioned George Washington crossing the Delaware late Christmas night. But even though I'm quite a student of history, there were all sorts of things in the book I did not know. And one of those was I had no idea that George Washington had a humpback camel there at Mount Vernon for Christmas. How did you find that?
That's right. Well, in doing research for a book, you always learn quite a bit, actually. And I was surprised to learn, too, that George Washington actually rented a real-life camel for his Christmas guests to see at Mount Vernon in 1787. And the Washingtons had many visitors. And as an animal lover, much like my husband Newt, George Washington thought his guests would find the camel fascinating. And they truly did. And it's kind of neat. Today, if you go to Mount Vernon at Christmas time, they actually have a camel there for their guests to see. And the camel's name is Aladdin. And that's always a lot of fun for kids and adults alike.
Yes. One of the others is, Christmas also is celebrated in the White House. And, of course, one of the stories you tell is about President Andrew Jackson, who was kind of like a Santa of sorts, you say, to present presents to the orphans in need and things of that nature. There were different parties, I know, during Andrew Jackson's administration. Matter of fact, one, as I remember, that got way out of hand, but nevertheless, that's another story you tell. But I think it's also striking to see how Christmas was a cessation of hostilities, whether it was in the Civil War, whether it was in World War I. Oftentimes, even if we were in the midst of fighting a major war or conflict, it's something about Christmas that at least had a cessation of firing on one another for a short period of time.
That's right. You know, some of the best things about America and our traditions have always friends, and charity. So even in the worst of times, we have celebrated this holiday. And I do talk in the book about Christmas celebrations during World War I and World War II. For example, in World War I, we have American soldiers who actually helped French children celebrate Christmas during this war. The children were afraid they wouldn't be able to celebrate, and they extended a Christmas party to these French children. We also talk about German soldiers and American soldiers having a Christmas dinner together in the home of a Belgian woman where we're all fighting with peace, and they had a peaceful Christmas dinner. So some stories that are really very important, and I think a good lesson for our children.
Let me, just before I run out of time, talk about the fact that we have a link to gingrichproductions.com. This book is part of Regnery Kids. So again, you can go to regnerykids.com. Of course, we have a link so that you can order it. You probably can find it in your local bookstore. And I would really recommend that you get all 5 of the books that we've just mentioned here. But talk about some of the other resources there, because both of your books are linked there so people can see that. There are all sorts of trailers, other great resources. So just for a minute, talk about when people go to gingrichproductions.com, what will they find?
Sure. Well, gingrichproductions.com is a multimedia company, and together Newt and I have produced historical and public policy documentaries as well as written several books. So some of the movies that we've written recently include, some of the movies we produced have included 9 Days That Changed the World, Ronald Reagan, Rendezvous with Destiny, A City Upon a Hill, and Divine Mercy. So those can be found at gingrichproductions.com. We're currently working on a movie on George Washington, and it will be called The First American, to be released on February 22nd. So this is about the father of our country, and geared particularly for the 30 and under crowd who may not know about George Washington.
Well, again, I would highly recommend, like I said, Ronald Reagan, Rendezvous with Destiny, as well as some of the other films we talked about, Divine Mercy, A City Upon a Hill, America at Risk, 9 Days That Changed the World, and much more. All of it available at that website, which we do encourage you to go to. It's gingrichproductions.com. And Callista, also, we have not only put the book up there, but also just a short video, and I encourage people to watch. It's only about 43 seconds long, and then to click that share button, put it on your Facebook page, and educate a few more people. And if you're thinking about Christmas presents or thinking about young people that need to know a little bit about American history, these would be ideal books. And so I appreciate you writing them, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you for having us, Kirby.
That's all we have for today, and let me encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net. You can find my commentary there. You can find the links to both books by Newt Gingrich and Callista Gingrich. And again, I would encourage you to consider the entire series. And I've been very encouraged lately about the number of books that have come out by various authors like Lynn Chaney and Rush Limbaugh and others, really trying to educate young people about America's heritage. We have lost a generation. We have revisionist history, and anything we can do to turn that around, I'm excited about. So again, this is why we wanted to spend just a little bit of time today talking with both Gingriches, and we encourage you to go to our website, pointofview.net, to find out a little bit more. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Chris for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day, and we will see you back here tomorrow.
This time of year, it seems everyone's looking for a better, more affordable healthcare solution. But with costs rising and options limited, where do you turn? If you're a Christian, you turn to Medishare. It's not insurance. It's over 154,000 believers who share each other's medical bills. It's about half the cost of healthcare insurance programs. And it's fully acceptable under the law. Best of all, Medishare is based on the timeless principles found in God's Word. You never pay for things that go against your beliefs. Medishare is healthcare that fits your family and your faith.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your healthcare. For your free information guide, call 844-45-BIBLE. Not available in Montana. Medishare, affordable biblical healthcare. Call 844-45-BIBLE. That's 844-45-BIBLE.
A big thank you to members of Truth Team 360. You make this program possible. Not a member yet? Join today at pointofview.net. Click on Donate Now and become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.